So in the last video we talked about selection and fitness and the idea of how natural selection works and the kinds of pressure that animals are usually put on that actually leads them to actually develop and evolve over long periods of time. Now in this video I want to talk about the factors which affect how fast this actual process is going to be. One of the major factors which will affect the speed of selection is going to be its intensity. To give an example of this, imagine that very quickly a virus spread across the entire human race, but this virus only affects light-colored skinned people, and then if they were exposed to the sun, all of them would die after being infected by this virus. I believe that this would be enough so that in a few generations, maybe one or two, the entire human population would change into a darker skin color, because that would be a major advantage. Because so much pressure is being put, it's like make it or break it, you white, you die, and so that would be bad. Likewise, sometimes in the environment there's a lot of pressure towards a specific look, and that's why the population will shift very quickly in something that's called punctuated equilibrium, because the selection intensity is very high. It's kind of like there's only one way of surviving. If you deviate from this way, you are dying, and so that's why it's going to make a big difference. That's why it also depends on the trait, because I talked about this in the taxonomy lecture series. Some traits are going to be selected for more than others, because think about neutral variation, for example. That doesn't make absolutely any difference in selection. That can actually mutate as much as it wants, and it won't make any difference for the selection process because it's neutral. But what if the trait that you're looking at has a variation that actually is crucial for survival? It takes about something like the ribosomal RNA. If you change the RNA, you're going to change your protein making machine, which makes everything that you are. All your proteins are made by ribosomes, and if you screw up that machine, you screw up everything. And so it's so important. It's such an important trait that selection is incredibly slow in that, because the intensity is insane for ribosomes, because if you change even a little bit, you can compromise the functionality of the ribosomes and cause major problems for the organism. And that's why the intensity makes a whole difference at the speed at which the selection will actually take place. Another of these factors is going to be the initial allele frequency. And depending on how much of each type of allele you have to begin with, it's going to affect how fast this selection actually takes place. If you have more of the allele, it's going to take longer for selection to completely eradicate it or to fixate the opposite gene. Likewise, if you have less of the allele, it will take a shorter period of time for selection to completely eradicate it. However, the more of the allele you have, the easier it is for selection to actually work on it. So the rate of evolution will be faster with more of the allele to begin with, but it will take longer because you start with so much. But then the rate will start flattening out or slowing down as the alleles become rarer and rarer in the population, because it's hard to find them to select against them. And so as you become rare, it's easier to actually mask that look and get away with it in the population. Now remember also, of course, they will still affect whether the gene is dominant or recessive. Dominant genes always get expressed, and so it's very easy to select against them. But the recessive genes, not so much, because some of the recessive genes will be masked in the heterozygous look, and then it will be hard for you to select against them. Likewise, the relationship that exists between pairs of alleles will determine how fast they're going to be evolving against. And sometimes if you have multiple alleles, like the ones you see in the picture here, that's going to affect also the selection rate. If you have multiple alleles, it's not going to happen as fast as if you have only a few alleles to select from. So variety will also slow down the selection process. By the way, this graph is trying to show you something that's called balanced selection or balanced polymorphism, because there's a high concentration of alleles in the middle here. It's like no one has a big advantage basically. But notice that one specific allele is giving a big advantage and eventually become fixed in the population. That's the one that's going up there, But the majority of the alleles are not giving any peculiar advantage too much, and so they're becoming homogenized on the middle. The top one is showing you the dispersive evolution or radiative evolution, where you see that the alleles don't necessarily have frequencies which are going to be equal, and so you're going to have one look or the other kind of forming, and you're going to have more polarization of the looks across time. All right, but all of these rates will depend on a lot of factors, including the point of where they began from, and whether they're dominant alleles or recessive alleles, or even how many alleles are present in the population. So the degree of variation will also matter. If there's a very little variation in the population, it's going to be easier for you to have a fixated gene. But if you have a lot of variation in the population, it's going to be easier to become homogenized and what they call a balanced polymorphism, or a bell curve kind of this continuous variation set up when you have a lot of the genes which are kind of like in the middle, all right, or the heterozygous looks, which are mixed in. Now, the other thing that will also cause differences is the diploidy. Remember, we talked about this, that the recessive allele is sometimes masked by the dominant allele, and therefore it's going to slow down the selection of the recessive allele because of the heterozygous, especially when the heterozygous receives an advantage, which will cause balanced polymorphism, like we talked when we talked about the sickle cell anemia versus the malaria example. Other advanced genetic relationships will also screw up the rate of selection, because if you have something like epistasis, for example, and you have a set of 3 genes which kind of interact with each other, and in order to make the black, you have to have the Y gene and the X gene all work together to make that actually happen. It's a pathway. It's a biochemical pathway. You screw up anything in the pathway, the whole thing gets screwed up. And so it's very hard for you to select against the Y, because, that would mean selecting against the Z. And so you can't select against them separate from each other. And therefore, the Y is part of a relationship which protects it against selection, this epistatic relationship here. Likewise, genes in multifactorial traits will be very hard to select against, because you can't really separate the effect of any one given gene. Because when you see the trait, you're not seeing the effect of a single gene. You're seeing the effect of multiple genes. So, how would you say, okay, I'm going to select against this gene? Well, it's hard. Like, what exactly is this gene causing? It's actually acting together with a lot of other factors. So either you select against them all, or you don't select against any. And typically, actually, multifactorial traits there will be so many different variations of combinations of these multifactorial traits upon the population, because sexual reproduction is jumbling around which genes you have together with other genes. And so it's going to be very, very hard for any particular set of genes to be evolved against if you have multifactorial traits, which is an advantage that we humans actually have, because we have so many genes which are multifactorial, like skin color, hair color, and so forth. Now, likewise, you're also going to have protection if your gene is pleiotropic, because even if this gene is causing severe problems, it might also cause things which are crucial. For example, the genes that cause cancer, some of them actually have crucial roles in the body, and they do multiple jobs. So if you delete the cancer gene, you'll also cause major problems in the functioning of the system, and so you can't delete that gene, so it sticks around even though it causes major problems. So you see how it's very hard to select against genes like that. You also have the thing I talked about. When you have multiple alleles, it's harder to select against a certain specific type of alleles, because you have so much variety in the population, so many different ways, and so many different situations in which each kind of allele could probably find a niche to survive. And that's why variation also leads to higher survivability rates in a species too. So, and also you have epigenetics. You see a beautiful girl and you say, wow, she's thin, she looks such a pretty face, and look at the, she's so fit. But you don't know if she had plastic surgery and she tans all the time, and then even if she puts a lot of makeup and if she even looks like that. Likewise, you see a red flower, you don't know if it's actually supposed to be green, but changed by the environment in which it's in. You see a person who's intelligent, you don't know if it's just born that way or just learned to be that way. So the environment can sometimes change the way the genes are expressed and kind of fake the look, and so, or changes the look or affect the look. And so even though you're ugly, really, you look pretty because you change yourself, and then you pass your ugly genes to the next generation, kind of are masked by the effects of the environment. So that's also going to make it very hard for any peculiar trait to be evolved against. And then there's the fact that we are organisms made of multiple genes, and that's going to be very hard for you to select against any one peculiar trait, because at the same time that you may have that trait that might be bad, you might have so many other good traits that make that bad trait inconsequential. It's the total package that you select for or against, and not just one trait, unless that trait is very crucial. Think about us, for example. We're not particularly fast. We're not particularly have good eyesight. We don't particularly have strong, or we're not particularly very tough. But we are so smart and so able that we have able to outperform animals which are stronger, poisonous, faster, better eyesight, better hearing, better smelling, stronger, tougher skins, all of these things, because we have a good package. So looking at each one of these traits, you would think that we would be weak and selected against, and that we would be getting faster over time. But we don't need to get faster because we have our brains to make up the difference. And so that's why you can't select against certain traits when other traits are making up the difference and making sure that you still have a higher fitness and therefore passing on the genes of the traits which are not necessarily good. And since sexual reproduction sometimes jumbled up the genes and puts some bad genes together with some good genes, sometimes the bad genes get passed on along with the bad genes. And that's why all of these things will slow down the selection ratio. So as you see, it's very complex, the order at which selection takes place and the factors which affect how fast selection will actually happen. Alright? Now on the next video, we're going to talk about the types of selection advantages and the directionality of selection. I'll see you guys then.